nu in het Engels zal verder gaan. Ook de presentaties en de vragen zullen we straks in het Engels laten doorgaan. So welcome again. The remaining part of this seminar will be in English. The seminar will be recorded and published on the YouTube channel of Statistics Flanders. Before we start, may we ask you to turn off your camera and mute your microphone. You can ask questions by raising your hand after each presentation. I will give you the floor then. When you have a question, don't forget to turn on the microphone and the camera. I think most people who subscribed are in the meeting now, so I can tell you a bit more about the program. We have two presenters today. First, Frauke Kreuter, professor at the Universities of Munich in Germany and Maryland in the USA. And secondly, we have Roland Beerte, chief statistician of the Flemish government, and he will take the floor at the second. So now it's time to announce properly Frauke Kreuter. She is chair of statistics and data science in social sciences at the University of Munich in Germany. She is also a professor in the joint program in survey methodology at the University of Maryland and co-director of two data science centers, one at the University of Maryland and one at the University of Mannheim. Frauke is an elected fellow of the American Statistical Association and the 2020 recipient of the AAPOR Innovators Award. Related to the discussion of today, she is a co-founder of the Coleridge Initiative, whose goal is to accelerate data-driven research and policy around human beings, and founder of the International Program for Survey and Data Science, developed in response to the increasing demand from researchers and practitioners for the appropriate methods and right tools to face a changing data environment. As announced, she will talk to you about alternative data sources for official statistics. Frauke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here for this presentation. I learned that we have a variety of people here from other government agencies and the university, as well as Statistics Flanders, and so I'm looking forward to a broad discussion. I will hint at technical details here and there, and I'm happy to dive in, but I try to keep it broad and conceptual to match the audience we have here. So I also sitting in Germany, and it's very gray here, and so I thought I need to throw in some fall colors because I missed them hoping for spring, but neither one seems to have happened here anytime soon. Hope the weather is better where you are. All right, so let's dive in. I have three parts to this talk. The first one is rather general, basically giving you a survey statistics perspective on sort of this question on using alternative data sources. Then I have a part that goes into in depth into two examples where we use approaches to data collection for official statistics that somewhat novel, I shall say, you know, maybe not as novel anymore as when we started and conceptualized them, but still probably worthwhile looking into. And I pair that with the short discussion of privacy, because that is a topic dear to my heart and important to keep in mind. And as you heard in the introduction, I am passionate about educating, and so I have a few slides with me on the international program that was just mentioned, in case someone is interested and wants to dive deeper into these topics. You also have heard mentioned APOR, the American Association for Public Opinion Research. We have it's an organization actually through which I've met many of you, because while American is in the title, it has a quite international focus, and together with Japek, who many of you might also know, she's at Statistics Sweden in various leading roles. We chaired now 17 years ago, I can't believe it, sorry, 7, not 17, not this April task force report on big data. And that was sort of the starting point for this community to think about how to use alternative data sources for largely official statistic production, but also public opinion research. And since then, I've been involved in various efforts, including this textbook that you see on the right, which we wrote as part of the Coleridge Initiative. So a lot of what I'm saying here, you can find in these documents. The textbook, I shall say, is available online for free, and it's now in its 2nd edition, so we're trying to keep it up to date. In case you're interested, the link is also on the slide. The focus on federal statistic is even more pronounced in a 3rd endeavor that I was involved in, which was a committee from the National Academy of Science in the US, a consensus study report like the academies often do, on federal statistics, multiple data sources, and privacy protection. So you can see the themes and why I bring in privacy here again. This committee was chaired by Bob Groves and was a reaction to something that I think we all feel very painfully, which is the drastic decline in response rates. Pew Research Center created this nice graph, and I should ask them to update it, although I'm scared to see what the numbers will be in 2021, you know, if they creeped sort of very close to that 0 line. But what you see here is, I guess, nothing entirely new to many of you, or at least those involved in primary data collection, that no matter the mode of data collection, whether it's face-to-face or phone, it's very difficult to get people to participate. And from a statistical point of view, that wouldn't be a problem as long as the missing cases are missing at random and we can adjust for it. But the costs go up, right? If you have to contact a lot of people and you can't reach them, particularly with face-to-face surveys, that's just prohibitively expensive. And so people looking for alternative ways, both, you know, moving to the internet a lot, and that has happened here massively, happened in many countries massively during the pandemic. And of course, now the question is, how much of that will we preserve, or do we go back to some of the initial modes? But also, I guess, folks are hungry for alternative uses. And so I do want to talk about these alternative data sources and discuss with you how they can enhance our measurements. I'll make a pledge for a purposeful design, or some thinking, I guess, on the resulting data products, and a pledge for the need to understand your data generating processes. And for that to not be so abstract, you know, I will reiterate on these themes in the examples, but this, in the first part, I want to get these points across. One differentiation between these various data sources that always helps me well when I think about this is to use this pairing of two, you know, broad descriptions of data sources, where what we've been traditionally doing, collecting survey data or planning experiments, and to some extent using administrative data sources, can be thought of as data that are designed in their data collection for a specific purpose. And in the survey context, it's quite obvious because we have stakeholders that decide on a particular research question, and then a lot of time in discussion happens to design that questionnaire that really measures that right, or at least ideally it should do that. But these alternative data sources that we have, and now even more, I mean, just think of what we are doing here, right? WebEx environment in which we are, or no, Teams, I guess we are on. Anyway, they can collect data, and they could collect data on us. you guys have your videos off, but were they on, we could collect what we call paradata. We could watch your eye movements and see how engaged you are in this presentation and the like, right? So those data happen organically and they create measurements, and the world is full of them. Most prominently are transaction data from credit card purchases, and many countries have tried to look at the inflation indices through means of that type. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But also the social media and other data sources in which people post their opinions a lot are an attractive source for social science researchers. And Roberta Rigon-Bon, in one of these meetings of the panel, had called those aspirational, which I still like, because we often feel like what's portrayed there is more the world how we would like it to be, or some would like it to be, than how it actually is. Twitter was also a data source that researchers from the University of Michigan, in particular Matt Shapiro and his colleagues, have used in order to create an alternative index for unemployment insurance claims. So they thought, well, if people post on Twitter, I lost my job, shouldn't that be an early warning, you know, that stuff is going on even before they go and register for benefits and things of that nature? And they started this right around the time when we had this panel. So, you know, probably the first ideas about a decade ago. And then when you more recently visit this website, right, then you see this work in progress, you know, updating our model and whatnot. I mean, this project died basically, right? That's the bottom line here. I used to be able to pull graphs of this, and it just didn't work the way intended. And we've seen this with various other endeavors of that type, that there was great promise, and without a doubt, the machine learning community and the natural language processing community has made incredible progress in the last 10 years. But capturing the very fast changing nature of how we talk about something is not just preventing us from properly creating, for example, these unemployment insurance claims indicators, but also to, you know, successfully combat hate speech and things of that nature. It's a very hard problem because, you know, every community talks about things in a different way, and you can create these indices, but then they might be very biased because the models are trained to work for a specific set of the population and maybe not the whole set and the like. There are some indicators that work a little better. We have seen Statistics Netherlands making good progress on their economic outlook indicators, but yeah, it's difficult. Another project that started with a lot of enthusiasm in a lot of countries, including Germany, and well, I only pick those that I happen to know of or be involved in part. But you can tell me there might be more. And this is a European collaboration, or was in its start, to do job vacancy prediction from postings on the web, right? Similar idea. There are a lot of job portals, and shouldn't it be possible to just use web scraping and process all the data, and then we can do the analysis, and we know the job vacancies, and we don't have to ask the companies about their open positions. And this is an important indicator all across Europe, probably all across the world. You know, we need this for planning purposes. And, you know, the folks that, I mean, I really admire all the thinking that went into this, but it becomes clear very quickly that there are other mechanisms at place with these postings that are just very hard to sort out in a passive, sort of distant observatory manner. For example, you know, speaking again from experience here in Germany, there are companies who just, or in the US too, who just have always a posting because there's certain, you know, survey methodologists, they're highly sought after. So Vestat always posts jobs for sampling statisticians, because if there happen to be one floating around, they want them to apply, whether they have an opening or not. They'll create a position if someone shows up, right? And likewise, there are the jobs that are never posted, or jobs that are posted with sort of a blanket description, and then work as an entry door for all kinds of other things. So this makes it difficult to get precise statistics, right? And it keep that in mind, because in using these alternative data sources, I think our biggest challenge is to change our mindset on how we think about measurement, to really think about what it is we really want to measure. And I'll go into more detail after showing you a few more examples what I mean with the potential for the data sources. So, these two examples could be expanded on, every year, every quarter, we can probably add additional ones to them, because more and more of our activities happen online, right? I mean, I mentioned, our meeting here and the data we could collect. In general, you could say we're moving more and more from a purely analog world to one that is digital. And this is true then that we can observe not just individual behavior, but also social interactions in this way. We can capture text messages that are sent from two people that both have a phone. That's, super easy and often done. Increasingly, we can do research and learn about collaborative work and shared programming. There's a lot going on trying to research this kind of thing. But also, of course, on physical activities, just think about all the pledges for data donation that happened in the COVID pandemic. So there's a lot going on, and I guess this picture should be animated, since I'm expecting these dots to move to the right. Now, a common concern we have when we try, or when we think about capturing these data types, is that what we really try to do, though, here in the social sciences or in official statistics, is that we want to do inference of three types, right? We want to describe the society, ideally most accurately how it is today, and maybe have, precise percentages or other point estimates on what's going on. We want to make causal claims. We want to understand why certain things happen, and be able to nail down predictors of that. And then we want to do actual prediction tasks. We want to, ideally know what's happening next year, right? Or how are the prices developing? What can we expect? How are the jobs developing? Where are the openings? Where do we have as a government to jump in and regulate, right? And I'm giving these examples because the promise of the tech world, that prediction is so easily doable with machine learning, is a great promise, but it is much more difficult in our context, because we're not predicting the place on the screen where you click next, right? That's a very easy prediction task, in a sense that, there's a setup and a context, and then the next second you click on something, right? And it happens a lot of times. So you have a lot of training data and nothing happens. I mean, the setting is very controlled, because you can, if you think of a news feed in a social media application, you know exactly what's on the news feed. Everything is controlled, and then the next click, and yet there could be the phone ringing or the battery dying in that very moment, right? But those might not happen all the time. But just think about all the things that can happen between this month and next month, and why it might be much more difficult to predict the development of prices, say, or jobs. Now, in this inference task, when we design a survey statistician, a data collection, we were trained, or most of us still, right, to make sure that these data sources we are using have two characteristics, meaning that they have a positive and a known selection probability, so that we can be sure we are representing the population correctly. And the thing is that, if this is in particular important for the activities that agencies like Statistics Flanders or the folks I'm involved in here in Germany, in the Institute for Employment Research, for example, that they are engaged in, right? Where we try to get precise measurements, percentages of job vacancies, say. For the other two tasks, causation and prediction, we could loosen up what we learned a little bit, right? And say, well, maybe we do not need a probability-based sample where we really know the probability of selection for every single object, observation, case, company, person. Because what we're interested in is the relationship of variables or the predictive power of certain variables to something else. And this is interesting to think of because the probabilistic selection that we always aim for, it really has two functions, right? One is sort of to get the exact point estimate, to know exactly what's your denominator and what's your numerator. The other feature that it has is that it gives us control over that we don't have systematic self-selection, right? That we are missing entire parts of the population. Now, but that is really less so the known selection probability. It is this feature that we have a positive probability of selection, meaning at least everyone could have the chance to be in the sample and is, you know, and it doesn't have a probability of 0, right? I mean, if someone is never online, then an online data collection just excludes that person by definition. But we could imagine settings in which we know, well, that everyone is contributing to this data stream. I don't know with which rate, but at least everyone or every relevant subgroup of the population is contributing to this data stream. And therefore, I can use this data stream because I can learn something about everybody in the population, right? To give you a drastic example, I didn't bring that, I have a couple of visuals for that, but I forgot to include them in the slide deck. But to give you an example, you know, when we talk about prediction and missing out on relevant parts of the population, face recognition systems, you know, have been in the news a lot because they are rather poor still, or worse at least, in their ability to recognize and classify people of color, right? And you know, that's because the training data for many of these systems were fed with people of a skin color more reflecting, you know, mine, you know, white people, male, probably those working at the tech companies. And that has for a long time sort of hampered the use of these. And that would be a typical example where you just don't have enough data of a certain part of the population, and therefore the system not working entirely well. Which brings me back to this question here, right? So we have this differentiation into designed and organic, where we have a lot of data that arise organically, and we need to understand that process of that generates the data streams in order to decide whether the streams can still be useful for causation and prediction, because they capture everybody in the population, even if I might not be able to get the exact point estimates. And if I do want that, then likely, and this is what the discussion in the last, I would say, 5 or 7 years, you know, since these first initiatives and looking at alternative data sources have happened, is that most likely to do this effectively for official statistic is a combination of data sources. That we need a basis that is really under our control, like the good old expensive surveys that we started out with, but then augment those with other data sources that give us a richer set of data, maybe more timely, but we have a way to benchmark and to check, did we get everybody from the population in the way we intended to? A friend of mine created, you know, we had this discussion, and he created this visual to drive that point home, and I still love to show it. You know, if you look at this picture here from Vincent van Gogh, that's not the friend of mine, although that would be nice, wouldn't it? And of the streets of Paris here. And, you know, these behavioral big data streams, right, they are in a way a blurry picture of society. A big one, we have a lot of data and we capture a lot of parts from the society. But had I not just shown you that street of Paris picture in the clear, you probably would be hard pressed to see here that there is a balcony on top and that there are stars on the skies and that there are like tables on the left, right? Now, you could also argue, though, that if I create my survey, I measure very precisely, spots of the population, but I'm also missing out, right? And ideally, we want to buy into this notion of combining these two sources to get a good enough picture of the population. And that's what we're aiming at when we try to make policy decisions or what have you. Another friend and colleague from Johns Hopkins, Roger Peng, he thinks a lot about data science and data analysis, and said at some point, one way to think about data analysis is to think of it as a product to be designed. Producing a useful product requires careful consideration of who will be using it. And I think the same would be true with data collection, or if we think of the broad pipeline of data science, that it really matters on what is the purpose that we have in mind. Just like I showed you before, you could make it easy and classify it in these three purposes of a descriptive statistic, a causal inference, or a predictive task. But it could, of course, be also finer grained. And in a way, you really have to evaluate a new data source that comes your way with this question in mind, for the particular purpose that we have in mind. Can they be used, and what would be the best design? And, Roberto Rigawan, who I mentioned earlier, he's a professor at MIT and had sort of pushed, I think, on, inspired all of us. Now, this really being, several decades ago now. With his start on creating alternative price indices that trail very well, and this is for the US, those produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What goes into these are online postings of prices. And he started this at a time when there really wasn't that much online shopping as we have today. And in particular, it was missing out entirely certain sectors, right? Goods and services weren't online as much, and only certain goods maybe. However, his thinking was the following: if I web scrape prices, and my purpose is the change to estimate the rate of change, right? Then the only assumption I need is that the rate of change of online prices matches the rate of change of those in real life, right? It doesn't matter whether I have all the goods and products and services online. It doesn't matter whether the online prices is generally higher or lower than the offline prices. What needs to be stable is the rate of change, right? And I thought that was such a brilliant idea. I mean, the thing is, he couldn't do this as nicely for the US if they weren't the Bureau of Labor Statistics still doing the current the consumer price index, where they basically create or capture the basket of good and know what it is that people are actually buying, right? And whether they still buy cars or moved on at this point. That is important, to get inflation indices right and what have you. But for this other piece, the very burdensome part of that survey, remembering what you bought and what the price was, and whether that price that you remember included tax and what have you. So that's the burdensome part about this in the US, because they prices are always listed without tax, with taxes varying so much across the states. Now that idea was brilliant because he really focused on the use of the statistic, right? So with this, let me move to some other examples that sort of, again, are driven by a use case, and that combine different data sources, just like the alternative price indices combined information from survey data to get the goods at all. What's the proportion? What are all the things that go into the basket, and the prices being measured in an alternative way. So this first example here is an economic research example, and the second example that I'll provide is in the COVID context. The 3 points I want to make for this example is that there are old measurements possible in a new way and maybe better way, but that we do need this combination of new measurements and survey data to get a handle on coverage error and non-participation error, and that there's still a lot of measurement error in these new devices that we need to pay attention to. So what is the research question that was driving this particular example? Again, in the employment-unemployment context, we were interested in doing a 21st century measurement of a famous study of the unemployed coming out of Austria from the 1930s. Some of you might know it, but some of you speak German and maybe even read the original version, Arbeitslosen von Marienthal. This was a study by Maria Jahoda and Paul Lazarsfeld and other colleagues in Austria that sent a group of researchers into a town that was subject to a massive layoff. And they were interested to see sort of pathways out of unemployment, and ended up describing sort of, barriers to re-employment, in particular the difficulty of, not having a stable rhythm, not having a specific time schedule, and just, there's this famous line, all in a sudden it was noon und plötzlich war es Mittag, indicating that, if you use a structure, if you use your social network, if you use sort of a routine activities, then it might be very difficult to get back into the labor force. And so the method they used was they sent these researchers into town, and then they observed and measured what's going on, right? They would measure how fast people walk and notice the slowdown over time. They would look how fast do they walk over a specific bridge, how many people they meet during the day, and a lot of interviews, but of the qualitative type. And labor market research, there hasn't been a study like this in a long time. Instead, we use surveys which have the advantage of having better inference properties, right? We were able to make claims about the entire country using our standardized instruments. And now the question is like, well, could we combine these two? Could we take, these passive measurement digital devices that we carry in our pockets, many of us anyway, and do this counting of steps and speed and interaction with the world, and then pair that maybe with some of these survey questions and that design in order to get a good read on what's going on. And we were inspired to do that from a pilot study that, or a data set that we used with the team of students. And someone is having their mic not unmuted. I keep getting a little bit of a feedback here. You want to check that. And what you see here on the left is a string of measurements. Every time an app is opened or closed, there's a measurement here indicating, the activity on the front of your cell phone for 10 people each, 3 groups, full-time employed, part-time employed, and job seekers. And, in this pilot study, we saw that there, you can, from these activities on what apps are used, differentiate different behaviors. So the full-time employed, not surprisingly, had heavier email use throughout the days than the job seekers and the part-time employed. Interestingly enough, not so much with the entertainment apps. Those seem to, at least in the way classified in the study, have been used by everybody in the same way. A little scary for us employers thinking about that way, but who knows, maybe they have been already in early versions of the metaverse. So anyway, inspired by this, we convinced the German Institute for Employment Research to let us collect such data. And in order to make sure we have a proper representation of the population, we collected these data in conjunction with an ongoing panel survey. So the Germans have a panel going on. It's called the panel of Arbeitsmarkt und soziale Sicherheit, what is that? Labor market and social security. It has been running for about 10, I think 12 years maybe by now, and is a dual frame sample, like households selected into it, and in those households selected from all the social security notification, plus a random sample of households from the resident population to capture those that are not part of the labor force so far or are self-employed. And those are paired with the administrative data, meaning every employer issuing administrative data to the social security system about, begin and end time of their employment and the salaries and some other basic demographic information. Now, this population then was asked whether they have a smartphone and whether they use an Android phone, because that's what we used in order to create the app that captured our measurement. And clearly, that's not everybody. And clearly, there might be segments of the population that we miss. I'll show you in a moment who that might be. But because we started out with this survey that is, expensive and big, and we have our arms wrapped around it, we can estimate the coverage error and non-response error that happens through the invitation, right? So our actual sample is even smaller, but we have enough statistical information to know where our biases are and correct for them, right? So aside from not having the smartphone, we corrected and know and can estimate who is willing and able to download the app. Now, if we look at just coverage part, this is the share of the German population on the y-axis from 0 to 1, or 0 to 100, if you think of it in percentages, and age groups on the x-axis. And what you see here are different smartphone operating systems at that time of data collection. And what was interesting for us is that the coverage of Android phones is pretty good across the whole population. The elderly have, not surprisingly, less likely to have smartphones in general, but the composition of Android users matched quite well the overall composition. In general, we saw smartphone ownership correlates highly with educational attainment, immigrant status, and region, whether they live in East or West Germany, and the community size. But again, the biases by operating system were, most pronounced in Apple iOS and Windows operating systems for the phone, which, if you look here closely at that, they're more popular among the elderly, and I can attest to that. My parents also have Windows operated phones. But with Android users, we're able to look at our sampling frame and saw that it is a good basis. And just a quick sneak peek on the results, or what it is then what we did. I mean, we issued an app, and that app measured all kinds of things. It measured a step count. It measured any opening and closing of an app, any text message that was sent out to someone else. We read out the phone book and hashed all the phone numbers and the names. But before we did that, we pinged them against a name and ethnicity classifier to get some information on the heterogeneity of the social network. So it's a pretty rich data source. What you see here depicted are sort of readouts of the activity data, because, as I mentioned before, in this Marine Tile 2.0 idea, the question was, do we see a difference between the employed and unemployed in their activities, and over time a loss of the daily structure. these graphs here don't show that, but we have others, and we did see actually an interesting phenomena that there seems to be a change in activity level and daily structure among the male unemployed, but a lot less so among the females. And you know, that for those that do the labor market research is of course an interesting area to look at. For us here, I want to talk about the errors that we captured or noticed in this measurement, in this passive measurement. And I grouped them here into 4 types: hardware, user, context, and software. And you know, when you rely on these passive measurements, and you know, during the pandemic we saw this a lot, right? We wanted to see, do people move less, and can we use the Google statistics to show that, and things like that. Well, there are measurement errors in these devices, and they are driven, for example, by the battery status of the phone, by the built-in sensors that also have requirements on the phone. They are a function of the operating systems and the like. They vary a lot by the software also, you know, the manufacturer settings on battery saving modes. They're software driven in the sense that they're, you know, on some phones they are in order to save battery, task killers that would, you know, shut down an app that's running in the background like ours that would collect these information. And so, you know, you can't, just because you have, you know, set your mind to collecting passive data via smartphones, assume that this happens smoothly, right? I mean, in our case, we collaborated with a company whose entire business is not to collect survey data, but to collect network strength data. So they, you know, they're the ones that for each area in Europe sort of create maps on signal strengths for various cell phone providers, and they really have that down to the minute on measuring in a way that doesn't drain the phone's battery, but that is a key element and a highly sought after resource. You see here, this is on the x-axis a measurement of sort of gap in or predicting here. This is a average marginal effect plot, the probit regression model, where we predict the probability for having a gap in geodata measurement. And what's interesting is that, you know, the newer operating systems actually create more of these gaps, and you can imagine, right? There's a lot going on these phones, and so they might be quite, you know, protective of the phone's battery or the operating version. You also see that there are fewer gaps when the battery is fully loaded of these phones. And there is variation in device manufacturer with, you know, certain types of phones delivering a more continuous stream of geodata measurements than others. There's another error source, which is the humans themselves, you know, as always, where the human flaw comes in. In part, technical competencies, although I can here too encourage, when you plan on such data collection, work with the pros and not necessarily with any run-of-the-mill survey company, because we, you know, that there was no problem in installing the software and what have you. But we did see a couple of users that had additional apps that would scramble the geoposition, or we saw, you know, different behavior on carrying the phone with you in the first place. What the reason we found this was that we noticed that there was one respondent who traveled very fast, you know, from Germany to Africa, and then we looked into this a little closer, and then we saw, you know, that this app that scrambles the geoposition basically swapped longitude and latitude, and of course, you know, that is a privacy enhancing measure, but then distorts our measurement. Not too many, luckily. We had 4 out of 621 participants in the study show this, you know, had an app of that type. But if you do this large scale, again, the question is always, does that interfere with your intended purpose of the study or the measurement you want to create? We also asked the participants in the study, they had the app running for 6 months, collecting data in addition to the original survey data we had from them. But we asked them at the end of the study to tell us whether they, have their phone always turned on and whether they keep it nearby. And you see that there too, there's quite some variation in people that say that they don't carry it with them, but keep it nearby. And we have in particular females being a little less likely to have it on them, but maybe have it in their handbag or what have you. And of course, if your primary interest were to measure step counts and whatnot, then that matters a lot, right? If it's in a bag and then you walk around in the house or in your office, then the bag might just sit there and all the steps taken are not measured, right? And we see similar differences with different age groups. I said earlier, the smartphone, not just smartphone ownership drops a lot with age, but the smartphone use itself also. And one thing that we did not have on our radar when we started the study was that there's a lot of this device sharing going on that, depending on what you measure, might matter a lot. Think of the entertainment usage app that I showed you earlier. Well, a lot of, and you might know that from yourself after 2 years of on and off home office, that it can be tempting to turn over whatever electronic device to a kid to get some peace and quiet for working. And so if you capture what apps are used and try to make inferences from that, then you might have an interesting mix of sort of, serious apps that adults might use and YouTube kid entertainment watching or what have you, right? We also had asked about third-party use, and we saw that indeed that there is a good portion of our respondents that had other people use them. And the questions we asked for this third-party device use was, what things were done, and in particular, surfing the web and consuming media. It seems to be a high proportion of those that did that. Okay, so that was the labor market. Now I'm switching to a different example, which is closer in time, more recent, and still keeps me busy pretty much every day and week, which was a global survey to measure the spread of COVID-19 and to investigate how well can we combine, again, traditional survey data with alternative data sources, in this case, the data that come from the Facebook platform, or I guess it's still called Facebook, even so the company changed its name. And the reason for this study was that early on in the pandemic, there were a lot of public health researchers that said we are in need of a syndromic surveillance, right? Meaning it is too late. By the time we get hospital records, by the time we get testing data, we need to ask people, a snapshot of people ideally every day about their symptoms, right? How do they feel, and whatnot, and use that to predict the outbreak, because only then do we have a chance to get the resources in time to the right places. And in particular, the World Health Organization wanted this, and epidemiologists and researchers working with WHO, because they worried that countries in which, these other sources of data sources don't exist are really disadvantaged, but also, in places where it takes longer to get resources brought to, that they need this syndromic surveillance, right? And so these various groups approached Facebook and said, well, you are a platform that is sort of around everywhere to different extent, but can you help us create such syndromic surveillance system? And the problem that Facebook faces, as we know very well in Europe in particular, is that they have a bit of a privacy thing going on, right? And And now all these regulations, in particular from the US FTC, is that if they were to be able to, or if they were to capture this information, then they can't share it out with the researchers, because any information that Facebook captures, cannot be shared out. So they ask us to partner with them, and us being the University of Maryland in this case, and Carnegie Mellon University, to be a partner so that we can collect the data. And so the way this ended up being fielded in April of 2020, and it's still running with by now over 100 million responses, is that, and some of you actually might have taken this survey, who knows, that when people go to Facebook, at the top of the newsfeed, you see an invitation to participate in this survey. And then when people say, yes, I want to participate, then they get transported over to a web survey data collection platform at one of the 2 universities. Everyone in the US, which were sampled with the higher rate and on a county level, because the Facebook penetration in the US is so much higher, were captured by CMU, and the rest of the world captured through the University of Maryland. And then the survey started, right? And so we used Qualtrics, and with the UMD Qualtrics installation, and then people would answer the survey question. You see here in the snapshot, it's probably too small for you to actually read, but in the past 24 hours, have you personally experienced any of the following symptoms? And then it goes through a list of symptoms. And a couple of more questions is about 2-3 minutes, the questionnaire. And this was fielded in all countries that Facebook is legally allowed to operate. We shared out in the aggregate data for all countries where we had sufficient additional information to create some non-response and coverage adjustment or weights for that. And try to get this sort of on a daily basis via an API out to policymakers, and still do. And then in addition, the non-aggregated data are available via a data use agreement with the universities. The survey instrument itself is translated, or the global instrument is translated in over 50 languages. That broke Qualtrics, by the way. These systems are not intended to field that many things at the same time. Not a non-trivial programming task. And it had 5 sections. Clearly, the consent section very detailed. Then these health symptoms that I mentioned, questions on contacts with others, a section on mental health, and some demographic characteristics. What we saw in the various publications coming out of it, that the early warning trailed well the actual development in the various states, but also across the world. We saw big uptake of the data in order to predict effectiveness of mask mandates, for example, and differences across the world. And we could spend hours now on looking at the various trend lines, but you can do that yourself too if you go to COVID map at umd.edu or to the CMU Delphi Group's website, and you can check out the various indicators, download tables and the aggregated data, or apply for the microdata via the Data for Good website that Facebook has. So, but here, in the alternative data sources, to reiterate that. Again, what worked here was that because of this partnership with Meta and the Facebook platform, their non-survey data, provided the basis for the random sample, the daily random sample of the population, in this case, the population being the active Facebook user base. And then the non-response weights were also created based on the Facebook data, meaning that they would run propensity score models to predict who will likely participate in the survey and who won't, and then add a weight to the cases so that we can adjust for non-response accordingly. And then we did a bit of a correction for non-coverage to the extent possible. That quality of the prediction, or the weights, of course, varies a lot by country and Facebook penetration. But again, think of that consumer price index example that I gave you earlier from Roberto Rico and Bond, right? In the syndromic surveillance use case, the interest is changes from this week to next week, or this week to prior week. And do we see an uptake of the pandemic, or do we see a downward trend, right? And or maybe even from today to tomorrow and what have you. And the fact that we had in a country like Germany 1,000 respondents every day answering this survey means that we can look at these changes, even if we think that or know that not everybody is on Facebook. But one of the questions was, do you know cases in your neighborhood, or in your immediate environment? And so there is a little bit of a social sensing going on, meaning that the people that we ask, also report on the rest, and we capture some of those that are not on the Facebook platform. Which brings me to my last topic, privacy, right? There's a little bit of an issue if you report about people that are not you, in the GDPR context, right? That we, obviously in this case, we didn't ask about names and what have you, and pretty safe in that respect. But in general, we do have to think about these increased privacy risks when we capture data, in particular from these smart devices. Let's imagine we didn't do that, but you could obviously also capture voice streams, turn the microphone on, record part of conversations and what have you. And even if the respondent is okay with you doing that, they might accidentally reveal information on other people, right? And so researchers in general need to have in mind the appropriate flow of data transmission. Helen Nissenbaum is a researcher that I like to cite in this context, who thinks a lot about this. She's at Cornell Tech. And of course, we need a research data infrastructure that allows this kind of data use and sharing. Now, I want to give you one example to drive home the point about microdata release and issues related to that. Netflix, right? We all love it, or well, maybe not all of us, maybe some hate it, but anyway, we all used it, or many of us used it during the pandemic. They tried many years ago to improve their algorithms on prediction of which movie you're going to watch next, with putting the data out there for researchers to look at, and use the did a Kaggle competition for people to predict that. Now, they anonymized them. They took all user information away. All they provided was the string of movies that people watched, right? And what's the harm in that? I mean, there might be other people who watch the similar movies or what have you, right? However, once we start combining data sources in the way that I mentioned before, really privacy risks can occur, right? Because there are other places on the web where people say, oh, on Friday I watched this, and on Saturday I watched this, and the week after I watched this. And so folks were able to de-identify users from combining the Netflix data and the data from the International Movie Database, or maybe public Facebook posts, but definitely IMDb, and could use the information on movies people said about themselves that they watched publicly, find those individuals in the database, and then saw all the movies that they didn't reveal, whatever porn or something rather that might be that they might not want to have to reveal. Now, this might not have been a large portion of the population that was de-identified in that way, but enough to sort of shake Netflix and let them take down the data eventually, right? And so we always, when we think about these consent, it's like, yeah, fine, we agree to a data use of a certain type, but it's impossible for us to keep in mind all the different ways that data could be combined, right? All the different ways that data could be used later on downstream. And so what I think is more important is that we keep thinking about this privacy issue and what is it that people want to try to protect, right, or have control of, and control over your data, that's a hard one, right? That encompasses a lot. But what people seem to be weary about is any inference made about them and maybe classified wrongly, right? That's the issue with the targeted advertisement. We don't want them to make inference about what we see, but maybe we want to say directly what we want to see. But then mostly the worry is about action done against oneself, right? And so, you know, maybe something for the discussion. I do think we need to rethink a little bit on how we deal with this privacy part, because if we just ask for consent, and we've done a lot of experiments of that type, asking, you know, at the end of a phone survey or at the end of a web survey, whether people would be willing to consent to have their data linked from the survey to some other data source. And we noticed that, you know, simple changes like moving the consent question from the front to the back change the consent rates. And yes, you can share my data dramatically. And so did the wording, you know, whether we framed this as a gain or framed this as a loss. It's the economist might relate to. And if consent changes that easily, I don't think we can say, oh, this is informed and a stable attitude, right? I mean, this is, anyway. So a pledge to think about this differently and think about data environments. The Coleridge initiative that was mentioned before is one of those where we create a secure facility where the hope is that data can be linked, and maybe in a way that doesn't require initial consent, because what is controlled is how the data is used and who is using it, and what products go out to protect privacy and prevent action against individuals. But all of this, of course, requires not just an infrastructure in the cloud to put the data in, but requires people to know how to use these various data sources and how to protect them and how to analyze them. And I promised I'll do a very, very quick pitch on those education opportunities. So let me take another minute and then I'm done here in showing you that we have, you know, in order to master this new world of designed and found data, started this international program in survey and data science with the aim of training working professionals. When I say we, I mean the joint program in survey methodology, which in itself is a collaboration from the University of Maryland, Michigan, and the data collection agency Vested, but in conjunction with what we call the international program in survey and data science. And with the hope, you know, to roll out, you know, the skills across the world. The way these courses work, it's a combination of asynchronous learning material and synchronous in-class meetings in the way we do here, and you know, tailored in a way that it works for those busy but in the need of having a structured learning environment, because I think we all know, having MOOCs on Coursera, you know, you get excited, you want to start using them, and then you give up because there's not a class context in which you learn and it keeps you going. So we try to combine these two elements here pretty successfully, and offer a series of open courses now that can be taken as one-off courses, going all the way from record linkage to privacy law, web scraping, API, Python use, and so on. Several machine learning courses. And what might be particularly interested for the group here, there are several certificates, for example, certificate in sampling or certificate in R programming or certificate in working with missing data, that are bundles and with an eye on official statistics. But even more importantly, there is now an entire bundle of the various classes which lead to an applied master in data science and measurement, which is AMOS certified as one of the Master of Official Statistics programs. And they are two, the full price, if you just add up all these courses, would be, to my view, prohibitively expensive. But we have scholarships for official statistics folks that brings it down to under 10K, which I guess is for a 2-year master program, or as continuing education, it's a 3-year master program, a pretty good learning opportunity. So if you're interested in any of these things, let me know. I shall say this is a non-profit endeavor, right? I mean, we're just trying to cover the cost of running these programs, obviously. So in summary, there's great potential in these new data sources. New questions can be asked. There are inference issues and data qualities issues that we have to keep in mind. we have to keep the privacy part in mind, but most importantly, we should go ahead and empower ourselves and those around us to be able to use these data. And with that, I say thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Kreuter. Does anyone has a question? If you have, you just raise your hand and then I'll give you the floor. I don't see any questions at the moment. Just gonna wait 1 minute. Roland, you have a question?
Yes, I have. Thank you, Frauke, for a really interesting presentation. We as kind of classically trained survey methodologists, statisticians, of course, we've always worked with this concept of a total frame for measuring errors in sources. Now, you've hinted at some aspects about that in your presentation, but do you think we should aim for like a whole new framework, like an overall framework that captures everything, or are things moving too fast in order to be able to do that? Should we look at a kind of more moving target there? Your microphone is still.
There have been actually various attempts by now to bring in or to create new total survey error frameworks or frameworks for capturing error sources of these alternative data sources. And, you know, we can schedule another talk and then I can talk about those. And of course, now I'm thinking, oh boy, I should have brought those. But all right, I'll feel guilty after we're done here. But there are, so Ashley and Maya, for example, or Paul Beamer, right? They have published quite a few now. And so in the Total Survey Error in Practice book that came out a while ago, there are some of these papers. There are papers in JSM, the Journal of Survey Statistics and Methodology, has a couple of those papers now that try to, you know, enlarge this framework. That can be done. And what you see is that the guiding principle is still sort of thinking about coverage, thinking about measurement, right? Who is missing out entirely and is the quality of my measurement enough? And I alluded at those in the two case studies that I showed you, right? The reason I took a different approach here, or what I think might be even more important than, I mean, so yes, these frameworks are important and we should do that. But I think what we need to do even more is to think about what are we using the data for, right? I mean, I had these countless discussions on the COVID survey data and is that good enough and whatnot. Well, it is good enough for certain things and it's really terrible at other things. It cannot produce a point estimate of number of vaccinated people in a country today, right? Because the population I collect from is not the random population of the Flemish, you know, or the Germans or whoever. However, if I want to know changes in syndromic appearance from today to tomorrow and is the trend going, then, you know, the probability that I'm affected with COVID is probably independent of my Facebook membership and usage, right? And certainly if I talk about the people environment. And so coming from the use and not, you know, and that is a real mindset shift because we classically trained people. We were trained in collecting data and having data that have many uses. They were designed for being sort of perfect and then be usable in a lot of different ways, right? But with these organic data that arise in some form or fashion, their use might be very limited at parts, you know. And so I think that what many of these error frameworks miss out on is sort of looking at it through the used lens and just going like, okay, measurement flaw, representation flaw, you know, and then stop there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you indeed. I don't think there are any other questions. Oh yes, there's one. Rudy Marijnissen.
I would like to ask you if you're some kind of worried about governments, academics having to beg for data by very large private organizations to be able to work with the data. Isn't that a bit frightening that the gathering of the data, the source we are willing to work with, is in the hands of some very great private institutions?
Yes, so I think that just like the use needs to be kept in mind, I think the incentives need to be kept in mind. Like, what, you know, who is collaborating for what reason, right? And obviously, you know, in this collaboration here, I mean, Facebook spent a ton of money on this survey, right? Lots of internal resources went into the data science pipeline to create these COVID measures. LinkedIn does similar things, right? They provide labor market data to governments, and they do that. They told me instead of doing any sort of public relation offices, they just, you know, provide data. That's their way to sort of get in the conversation with the government. So they have an interest, right? They have an interest in providing that. And in the same way, of course, for Facebook, that is a possibility to engage with governments and then, you know, talk about other topics too. Now, with that kind of invested interest, there's an interest to not just shut that down at random, right? Because that then would be a backlash that is also harmful for the companies. So I think it does depend on how this is structured. But of course, you know, a company, you know, lots of companies fail and go down or change their products, and that interest might change. Now, it is though the case that I think there was always and still is a reliance, even from us in the more traditional context, on, you know, private sector companies, maybe not, you know, as big, but if I see what's happening, at least in Germany, in the public opinion space, there are a lot of so-called public opinion measurement companies that employ measures where I don't think we can trust the results, right? And it is portrayed as, oh, this is a representative, you know, sample of the population, and they think this and that about the government. And that some of these sort of very easy to participate in web surveys or what have you, well, they are still surveys, but they can really be hacked because, you know, if the access is not controlled, then, you know, lots of people can go in. And so the risk of being dependent on another party is present, whether this is big tech or small tech, you know, and so I think again, we are probably depriving us from some interesting data sources if we are afraid too quickly.
Mm-hmm. I can follow that, but nevertheless, but that's just a personal opinion. I think governments around the world are losing a part of the responsibility they should have for generating reliable data.
Yeah, I do think that one big advantage we have, and that's why I mentioned these administrative data sources, right? So a lot of, like, what is it that the government really has control over, right? The government has control over government processes, and government processes are increasingly moving to the digital space. Remember that picture, analog, digital, right? So I mean, increasingly we're moving from analog to digital in government processes. And so we need to find ways to capture these data and make these data available. That's the first starting point, right? Rather than looking at private sector and tech and what have you fancy, right? Even so I brought these examples. I think that the key resources we have and we have control over are the data from government processes, right? Now, the problem is that we have this big push towards open government and open, and the fear that, well, we can't just put these data out in the public, right? And then it gets siloed off and not combined and aggregated in a way that it's not useful, and it has only like 5 statistics in it. And so I think the trick here will be to find a way to make useful products out of these administrative process data and maybe pair them up where needed with sample surveys to create enough of a, you know, collection of different pieces of information, but do this in secure environments, right? Where there is some input and output control on what's going on. And I think that's, I mean, there's, you know, great hope on Gaia in Europe that this kind of cloud environment could be used for that activity. But we have seen as part of the Coleridge initiative that can really work, because if the government see they have a use, you know, they can start learning using their own data and get some use out of it. That, to me, I think is the most promising route in this endeavor. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you very much.
Roland, did you want to add something? I saw your hand, but it's disappeared.
Yes, I did want to add something. I completely agree with what Frauke said in terms of the kind of difficulties and issues around that. Maybe one thing to add is that some countries, and even now I think at the European level as well, actually have introduced legislation where the government can make it compulsory for private companies to hand over their data to government. So in the UK, for instance, there is a law that actually says that the government can ask for data from private companies if it's needed for their statistical purposes. And so, of course, that's controversial. But then if you think back about what we used to call, or what we call the design data, the survey data, there have always been statistical laws which specified that, for instance, companies were obliged to participate in compulsory business surveys. So there's always been this tension between the government getting data from somewhere, and there always has to be a discussion about how far do you go in actually making it compulsory for private companies to hand over the data. Of course, the one issue with that is that as a government, you don't control the data, and if a company decides to change the data or to stop the data collection, you don't have control over that. So even there is legislation that actually specifies that companies should consult the statistical office before they change something in their data. So there are some countries with actually making efforts to improve that situation. So I just wanted to add that to this.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? I think we have just 1 or 2 minutes time. No. Then I think we can go to the second presenter of the day, who's already online and in the screen. That's Roland Beerte. Roland Beerte is the Chief Statistician of the Flemish government and heads the Flemish Statistical Authority and the Statistics Flanders network. He's responsible for implementing the Flemish official statistics policy, through which currently more than 300 Flemish official statistics are published on the website statistiekvlaanderen.be. Before joining the Flemish government, Roland worked for 20 years in the United Kingdom, first at the Office for National Statistics and then at the Royal Statistical Society, where he was responsible for official statistics policy, communication, and public relations. He's a member of several advisory bodies, and he will give us an overview of the actual project of Statistics Flanders.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Right, so I'm going to just speak a little bit about what we do with new data in Statistics Flanders and the Flanders Statistics Authority. It's by no means supposed to be an overall overview of everything that happens within the Flemish government, because there's lots of other people who are, of course, interested in these new data sources and are doing work on that. I'm also not going to use any slides, but I will just give you a quick overview of what we do. And of course, linking back to the presentation that Frauke gave, me and Frauke go back a long way, actually. Like, I think we met each other about 20 years ago in some workshops around total survey error, and we were both working very hard on things like non-response in surveys and so on. But it's actually good to see that people like Frauke are in the academic world continuing to look at the world through scientific fundamentals in statistics, things like differential statistics and so on. I think in this very data-rich world these days, I think it's all too often forgotten that statistics actually is a science with a scientific background. And it's not just about collecting some numbers from some people on the internet and then claiming to have a scientific truth or a scientific result from that. So I think especially, of course, in the last 2 years with the COVID epidemic, I think we've seen lots of examples, including from within academia, where people think that, okay, if you just do an internet survey, you just get some people to answer some questions, you'll get a good result. That's good enough for policy making or for decision making, which of course, as Frauke has shown, there was quite a few issues with that. Now, I think in Statistics Flanders, in the network, so in the different departments and agencies within the Flemish government, which are producing statistics, and within the Flanders Statistics Authority as well. Of course, we have moved from these designed data to the found data, to the organic data. But of course, as Frauke has explained, those organic data are quite new. And so we do lack the classic frameworks around inferential issues, around measurement issues, and so on, for these new data types. So I think it's really important that we as a community, and the academic community especially as well, that we keep on thinking about these sources of error, that we keep on thinking about the statistical issues around those data sources. Simply for the main reason that quality of what we produce, the quality of the numbers that we produce for decision making is absolutely key for government statistics. And of course, that goes back to the way that government statistics need to be trustworthy by nature in order to gain or to remain trusted by the population as a whole. So the trust issue is really linked to the quality issue. Quality issues really linked to us understanding the statistical issues around those data collections. In the next few minutes, I just wanted to give you an overview of the current data science projects that we run within the network Statistics Flanders. When I started this job actually just about 5 years ago now, I made it one of my priorities for Statistics Flanders and for the authority to really start working on some of these innovative developments around data. I think it's really important in the official statistics world that we keep abreast of these developments in new data sources. And so I think we really should engage with that. Even though it is at only a very experimental level, I think we really should do our best to get going on these new data types. And so about 2.5 years ago, we established a kind of data science hub concept where we've actually recruited like a senior data scientist within the statistical authority who really coordinates and also injects some innovation in some of the work around data within the Flemish government. So I'm very happy and very proud that we've been, in the last few years, have been developing some projects in collaboration with some other departments and agencies of the government, but also in collaboration with the academic world, because obviously lots of things happen in the academic world around these new data types as well. So I think the whole intent of this data science hub is to either create new statistics, basically just chart new phenomena for which no figures existed before, or to look at improving existing statistics. And I think one of the strengths of those new data types is that, of course, they are available much more quickly than, for instance, a survey where you have to wait for the data collection and the process. So between the data collection and the publication of results in a survey, quite often you're looking at a few months or 6 months. before the results can get out, whereas those new data sources have a much better score on timeliness, and they will give you data much more quickly. So that could be a way of actually improving existing statistics, is by combining different sources to do something around this timeliness, or to improve this timeliness. So I'm just going to give a few examples of what we've been doing within Statistics Flanders. The first project has been looking at Twitter sentiment within Flanders. And so basically, the objective there was to develop an alternative quality of life statistic based on tweets from Flemish people. Of course, we do have some current statistics on quality of life based on survey questions. But of course, these are infrequent and only get measured once a year or so. So with this project, we really wanted to keep kind of continuous finger on the pulse of the Flemish sentiment. And so the data we use is that every hour we request about 500 random Flemish tweets via the Twitter API. And so we basically filter the Dutch tweets coming from Belgian accounts. Then we use some data science techniques. This is pretty much copying work that has been done elsewhere, also in other government agencies. So we've been using a state-of-the-art deep learning model that was trained on 50,000 tweets that were manually annotated as positive, negative, or neutral by 3 job students. So that was the training data. And the current status of the project is that the first version has now been implemented and produces a sentiment score every hour. So we haven't published this work yet because this is still very experimental work, and there are still some pretty critical research questions that we want to answer before we go public with this. But we are looking at this, and we are working with the Catholic University of Leuven to look at those research questions. Another project that we are doing, again on Twitter, this is kind of in the same sphere as a Twitter sentiment project, is that we get lifelong learning. So there was a very strong policy need to actually try to find some information about how people in Flanders engage with lifelong learning. And there was actually very little information available from surveys on this. So the aim now is to use Twitter data to create a set of indicators on which policy making around lifelong learning can be based. So how much time is spent on lifelong learning? What's the attitude? What's the sentiment towards lifelong learning? And what are the most important blockers or enablers for lifelong learning? And so, of course, we are looking at Twitter's feeds again, so at tweets which are filtered based on the words in the tweet. So the words related to lifelong learning are being used as a filter. And of course, in cooperation with the colleagues within the Department of Work and Social Work, this is actually currently being worked out, so it's still in the development stage, this project. Another project is looking at web scraping. So I've talked about Twitter data. And so we are looking at web scraping of the company information to categorize companies as innovative or not. So we're looking at a complete and frequent statistic on the number of innovative companies in Flanders. This is happening with the Agency for Business Innovation, and actually is also replication of existing work at the CBS. So we are looking at work that has been done in the Netherlands, in the Central Bureau of Statistics. And so we use a classification machine learning model that based on the text scraped from the company's webpage, categorizes a company as innovative or non-innovative. And so we have been training this model using survey data from existing surveys. And so again, we are looking at the moment at anchoring that project, at really stabilizing this project by creating a data set that contains as many URLs of companies as possible based on the data bank for enterprises within Flanders. And on the final project, again, this is like very experimental. We are looking at prediction of relocation probability in the area of demography. So, of course, like it's very interesting for demographers to know when people move and at what time people move in their life stage. So we are actually looking at machine learning models that predict the probability of an individual moving within this and say 1, 2, or 5 years. And so, of course, the methodologies to estimate these probabilities exist already, but we are looking at creating a machine learning model that predicts the probability of moving. So we are looking at different machine learning models, classification models, and we are comparing those to see what the best results may use. Again, we are doing this in cooperation with the academic world. We actually have a master's student from the EMOS program, which is the European Masters in Official Statistics at the University of Leuven. And so this master's student is working under the guidance of the Statistics Authority, data science people, and the demographers to draw up and evaluate those models. So that's a quick overview of the data science projects currently run. It's as I said, it's very experimental work. It's beginning to look at some of the issues that Frauke has also outlined. But as I also said, I think it's very important that in the world of statistics and government statistics that we do keep abreast of these new developments in data and data science techniques in order to improve the quality of our statistics in the medium and long term. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. And thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Not at the moment.
Maybe people have gone to Twitter to check the sentiment on Twitter.
There's one, Laurent Franks. Please turn on your microphone. We're not able to hear you now.
Sorry for this. Okay. Well, good morning, and thanks for these two very interesting presentations. There's one thing that struck me, so something common to both of them. It's really the fact that most of these innovative approaches to alternative data sources very much focused on real-time predictions, evolution. It's about establishing sort of scoreboards of what is going on in society for some relevant variables or for relatively short-term forecasts. And I was wondering if any thought had been given about well, how this could be used for, let's say, more midterm or long-term projections, because, well, to be honest, I don't see them immediately, and I think it was somehow reassuring that in the presentation of Frauke, it was also an emphasis on the need, I think, to maintain surveys, for instance, to better understand things like attitudes or variables that cannot be captured from web data or from publicly available web data. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or observations to share. Thank you.
Okay, Frauke, do you want to have a go at this first?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yes. I had to change devices here in between. I think you're right that there is, as Roland said at the beginning of his talk, somewhat of a focus of seeing what maybe additional measurements can be taken that answer questions that we weren't able to answer before, and this is related to the timeliness. But that doesn't make these old questions become obsolete, right? And so I think, I mean, you speak out of my heart in the sense that this is purpose driven, but we need to take a hard look at which are the ones that we do need and which are the ones that we can afford to still answer, because, you know, that too is a matter of fact that for certain things, the data collection costs have just been very expensive. But I agree, we shouldn't, as governments, you know, just go after what's easy to measure and focus on that, because I mean, that would be the wrong way to go about it, right? The important way is to think about what are the informational needs and how best can we meet them.
Yeah, no, agreed. I think you're right, Laurent, that of course the focus currently on improving timeliness means that we are looking very short term, and we are looking at these kind of like immediate data releases and dashboards and so on. But of course, that doesn't obsolete the questions around the long-term perspectives. And I think there we will still be able to use, of course, survey data and administrative data. I think those remain important in any case, even for the short-term indicators, because as Frauke explained before, we really need to be able to combine data sources, existing data sources for which we know the quality indicators or the quality of it, with those new data sources. And like whenever I talk about combining data sources, I always think about the kind of concept of combining strength or borrowing strength from each other. So you can have the strength of like a very good inferential data source, like a survey, with the strength of the timeliness from some kind of organic data source. And you need to be able to borrow those two strengths from each other to end up with something good and something of good quality. So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, the current focus of lots of this work is on the here and now, trying to tell us what's happening right now. But of course, the long-term projections and long-term modeling remains very important as well. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Any other questions? Don't see any hands. No more questions? No. I don't think so. So if there are no more questions, I can only thank everyone for being here and for all the inputs we received. Special thanks to Roland Beerten and Frauke Kreuter. I will just switch to Dutch again for a minute to announce our next seminars. Dus inderdaad allemaal bedankt voor jullie aanwezigheid, jullie inbreng. Zoals gezegd wil ik nog even reclame maken voor onze volgende seminaries. Hou onze website en onze nieuwsbrief in het oog, want de komende maanden staan er nog een aantal interessante seminaries en een studiedag op het programma. Onze studiedag over regionale statistieken zal plaatsvinden op 10 mei. En op 24 mei stellen de studenten van het Data Science programma hun onderzoeksbevindingen voor. Dus ik hoop dat we heel veel mensen die hier vandaag waren ook 24 mei mogen verwelkomen. En als jullie zelf een idee hebben over een onderwerp dat een onderwerp kan worden van onze seminaries, laat dat dan zeker weten aan Dirk Moons, aan mij of iemand anders bij Statistics Vlaanderen. En dan hoop ik jullie allemaal binnenkort terug te zien. So see you later. Thanks everyone. Hope to see you next time. Bye.